So, what do we see today? So within Codec, we see enterprise are entering the third era of IT. So without doubt, digital initiatives and business growth are top priorities for CIOs. So from chatting to customers, what we're seeing is, and specifically with the recent events with the pandemic, is that customers, enterprise customers, all customers basically are looking to avail of the enterprise solutions that the cloud offers around security and how can they can enable their workforce to work more productively, specifically remotely in these days. So Codec, we are a full stack partner. We basically can provide the full Microsoft platform from Azure to BI services, content and collaboration. We've just someone else joining here, folks. I'll just let them in. Fine. So yeah, what we see is we see companies who are looking for a partner that can basically provide a number of the Microsoft cloud services, because these days we obviously see a number of solutions that touch on not just Azure, but on content collaboration like Teams, SharePoint, security, BI services. So at Codec, we can provide all of those solutions. We see ourselves as a dependable partner. So we're in business in 1985. Codec obviously have offices in Belfast, we have offices in Dublin, Galway, London, and in Europe as well, in Germany. So we're well established in business a long time, and we've a number of. Sorry, folks, we've got.
I'll take care of the letting people on. Don't worry, go on.
But we have, and we've been in business a long time. We've made a decision about 7 to 8 years ago to go cloud first. We still do on-site solutions, but our practice is cloud first. And we made the decision about 7 to 8 years ago. Our staff numbers now are at 240. We would have grown from about 80 staff 7 years ago to 240 now. So the business has been very successful and busy, very busy. These are some of the clients we've dealt with over the years. So you can see there's a lot of different verticals there, public sector, FMCG and the food and beverage side of things, all the way down to aviation. We would have some of the leading aviation companies on our books as well, and doing a lot of Azure projects with them at present. So in Codec, we value ourselves on, we've a lot of, we've quite a diverse range of staff in the business, a lot of, employees from as far as Brazil, throughout Europe, and then obviously a lot of Irish employees as well. It's a young enough company, and we do enjoy a challenge. A lot of exciting products, as I mentioned, using the cloud first strategy, and it's a good team there. So we like our customers to know that we've got some very good skill sets to help out our clients. This is a good slide. So this basically gives you an indication of the type of awards that we've got and accreditations over the years. The main thing to pick out here, I suppose, is that a lot of these Microsoft awards, so the 2019 Data Center Partner of the Year, Dynamics Partner of the Year, we've been, I think, 7 out of the last 9 years. And then we were the Partner of the Year throughout Ireland in 2018, 2019. So these are awards that we've been recognized by Microsoft for the work we've done on various different cloud projects, specifically with Azure and BI projects as well. So very proud of that slide. You see our ISO certifications on the right there, all tied into our security and services desk accreditations. So what we find today is that, as I said, customers have a lot of different touch points in their environments. They have hardware services, cloud migrations, and power apps, business intelligence. So there's a lot of different touch points within the business that companies have to manage, getting ongoing projects going on, and having to support as well. What we see is with our clients is that if they have too many vendors, basically, there's a huge management overhead to manage each of those vendors. There's that old problem of kind of stuff falling between the stools and potentially the blame game if a particular solution is having an effect on another part of the business. So we find it's a big challenge for customers these days. So what we find is, as a full stack partner in Codec, because we do the full platform Microsoft products, you basically have a single version of the truth with ourselves. They're blended solutions. So to give you an idea on that, basically all of our managed service and support desk and consultants, they all, within the different locations, those support teams are all sitting beside each other in those offices. So we have CRM consultants, Azure consultants, content collaboration. So customers can be confident that our post support, and as well when we're designing these solutions, it's a team effort and it's a platform approach to how we deliver these solutions to our customers. We also find that customers get more value for their money because we can put together the most cost-effective and efficient solution for them. This gives you an idea of the services we offer. So we have cloud and productivity, which is the Azure and content collaboration Power Platform. So we're now utilizing a lot of the Power Apps, BI services within the Power Platform, and that's kind of forms a part of all our solutions, BI and D365 as well. We also have a FinSol ERP practice that does a lot of the Microsoft and Oracle financial solutions as well, again utilizing the cloud and some on-prem solutions as well. What we find is obviously clients expect to have the management skills of what we call the big four in the market. That's what Codec strive through. Our AVR delivery model is basically, it's our delivery model for delivering projects. We built this with a project with Crossrail, which was a massive project for us. Project went over the last number of months. And basically it helps us accelerate projects and customers get value and get products delivered to the end user as quickly and efficiently as possible. We can go into more detail about that after the call today or on another call if needs be. So look, with any of the big companies, IT companies, partners you want to be dealing with, we obviously have our project management office, which is PMO. We have a number of PMs that are working within that team. On all projects we do, we've assigned a PM to make sure that project is delivered efficiently. Security is massive in everything we do. Brian would have a big hand in this, but any solution we put out there, specifically with the cloud, we always start with identity and access protection, threat protection, and basically utilizing all of the tools that Microsoft offer within the cloud. We would have skill sets across the board in all of them, whether it's from Office 365 to Azure, and I said identity. So be confident that we can include them in any of our project designs. What's key to us today is our business analyst team. So we have a team of analysts that basically work with our clients. With any cloud solution, you know, it's hugely important that we have to understand your business, and these consultants will work with clients to understand where the problems are, how the business operates, and as a result, we can basically deliver a solution that, you know, allows end users to get better value. You know, using the BAs means that when we implement a cloud solution, that user adoption and staff, employees actually take on the product and users, and you know, your investment is paid off, and we can manage that user adoption going forward as well. We have a QA team, so a lot of our solutions are obviously software development solutions, so we would have QAs who basically test all of those solutions before they go out. So we've automated testing. A lot of this testing can be brought into our managed service offerings as well after a solution goes live. We also have Codec Labs. So what we do in Codec is we create our own products. So we have our own wraparound, kind of our own IP on solutions, cloud solutions that kind of help them and help companies get the best value out of that. Some examples of that would be around, there's a good example here, GDPR for Dynamics. So we've created our own app basically that sits within Dynamics 365 and allows companies to manage GDPR within their business and report on GDPR as well. This slide here just gives you an example of many of the other ones that we're working on at the moment. So we would have some of the SharePoint side of things, BI, data protections, as I mentioned. So just to wrap up, for companies who are looking to go digital, we see ourselves as a dependable partner to use, very experienced. We can consolidate, so we have the full platform Microsoft products. We have experience in that area, and we have the management, the PM team to deliver that. And we feel as if we're the right partner. You should be chatting about your journey to the cloud. So as I mentioned just at the start there, Brian, you've taken over there. I'll let you run with that one. I'll catch up with it again. So basically, as I mentioned at the start, we have the offer from today. Brian's going to kick in now, but as I said, please do avail of our offer today where we can send in one of our cloud architects on a remote call or however it has to be done to sit with your team for 2 hours to discuss your where you are with the cloud and help you with kind of driving security and governance and helping you kind of put the right foot forward and how you should plan that strategy going forward. And you can scan that barcode there basically, and that will send you to our feedback form. I'll hand over to you now, Brian. Thank you.
Perfect. And if someone could just put that the link for that feedback form into some message window, that'd be super. Okay, so I just want to double check everybody can hear me okay, or James, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Brian. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, then we'll keep going. So my name's Brian Smith, and I'm the Cloud Practice Lead. I've been the Cloud Practice Lead for 5 years now in Codec. And today we're going to be going through the Azure Cloud Essentials. So the cloud platform practice within Codec, it covers off various aspects across the Microsoft Cloud in particular, from Azure to Office 365 and everything in between. When there are specialties such as like data, we have specific teams for those. But for the general infrastructure and platform, that'll fall under my team. So let's get started with the introduction to Azure. So what is the cloud? So the technical term is it's the practice of storing regularly used computer data on multiple servers that can be accessed through the internet. But what that really means is just a powerful way of transforming your business. So it gives us options that weren't possible before. So when you look at yesterday, we had limited tools. We had like one platform. You had data, but you couldn't really do much with it. And now with the tools that we have available today, it's much more flexible. So we've got all this data. We're able to make much better use of it. And it's more about the business than IT now. So we can focus less on the technology because we can move things forward at a much faster pace. So one of the main benefits at the moment is we've got this integration between tools and vendors. So a common theme that you'll see throughout today's session is that even though Azure is Microsoft's cloud, that it's quite open. So it's not just for Microsoft platforms. So it's open to a host of different platforms. So not only like Windows operating systems, there's Linux. And not only Microsoft's management tool sets, but also open source tool sets and third-party tool sets. So, and that's what's key. And you'll see as we go through this presentation, we'll give you some examples of that. So this is what Microsoft looks like from a networking perspective. So Microsoft have put a huge investment into Azure and the network that underpins it. So you can see here, this is a global map. There's data centers throughout the world, and this number is growing significantly. So every time I do the session, I have to update the next slide because it's got more data centers in it. But there's lots of subsea networking cables that are giving the best connectivity between sites. So to create your cloud strategy, there's a number of steps that we have to go through. And number one is the regions. So if you can look at this, map, you can see here that this is the current list of all the locations around the globe, and most of which you can put your resources within. Now, even though that's quite extensive, we have some customers where we go as far as Australia, but for the majority of the customers, what we're looking at is the European region. So I just sort of zoomed in on this. You can see that the North Europe is here. So that is in Dublin in Ireland, and West Europe is this one over here in Amsterdam. So typically we find that most of our customers will be deploying to one of these two regions, North Europe or West Europe. And I suppose if you take a look, one of the common things that we see when we're working with customers is that they would choose West Europe because North Europe is much more to the west than West Europe is. So that's something that we would see quite often. But there's a lot of regions to take a look at. Like we would do a lot of work with UK, and there's a UK specific region. So just with Brexit around the corner or in motion, this could become very important for those customers. There are some regions that are slightly different to others. So if you look here, you can see that in Germany, there's a public, and in Germany, there's a sovereign. So you got sovereign regions and public regions. And then these dotted ones are they're upcoming, so they're not actually released yet. But what's important to realize is that there's a number of Azure geos, and Azure geos are made up of region pairs. So like I discussed before, there's Europe, which is the North Europe, West Europe. That's probably the one you're going to use most, depending on where you are. But there's other regions as well. Now this specifically is around the European region. So there's Europe, the UK, France, Germany Public, Germany Sovereign, Switzerland, and Norway. Now they've also announced Spain, Italy, and Poland. And what's interesting about these three being announced is, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's an odd number, so they can't be a pair. Some regions share a pair. So because these aren't actually out yet, I don't know what the it is, but I would imagine one of those two regions is going to be the pair for the others. But there always is a pair. So something to remember is that a region isn't a data center. So a region is like a location. Then every region has a region pair. The region pairs are separated by at least 100 miles. So this is to try and minimize the effect of a physical incident. And there's platform provided replication. So as we start to go, oh, sorry, can you mute that, James? Mute, sorry. So there's platform provided replication within the region pairs. Now there's ways to do replication outside of the platform replication. So I'm going to bring you through what that exactly means and what our options are as we go through the session. And then there's sequential updates. So to make sure, I suppose one of the main reasons that there are pairs is for uptime and resilience. So what we need to make sure is that our uptime is important. So if there are things that might cause an issue, so they make them separated by at least 100 miles. So there's a physical incident that'll make sure that the impact is minimal, that it's unlikely to affect both regions at the same time. But like that, there are other things that can make unplanned outages, and one of those would be updates. So the Azure platform, like all the cloud platforms, it's constantly being kept up to date, being updated. What they do is, in the rare event that there is an impact to one of those updates, they never do it to the two region pairs until until they're sure that it's stable. And then there's a regional recovery order. So if there was an outage of both regions, they would concentrate on one of the regions first and then get the second up and running. So a region it's a set of data centers, and it's connected through a dedicated low latency network, and it's designed from the bottom up for resilience. So there's things called pods. So you've got your basic elements, which is your networking, your compute, and your storage. So it takes the three of those together, and it makes sure that there's the least likely, it's unlikely that you're going to have an issue with uptime. But if there is a problem, that it doesn't spread and cause a complete outage of a region or a data center within a region. And that goes right down to the power, to the comms. You know, it's absolutely separated out. So I don't know if anyone here has ever done a tour of the Azure data centers. So Microsoft were offering that at one point. I'm actually not sure if that's something they still do, but it's a really impressive thing to see, and it sort of shows you that it's an actual thing. You know, you walk in, you can see the steps that they put in place to make sure that it's as secure as possible, and that's, you know, not only from security but also for uptime. But not all regions are equal. So some services are only available in specific regions. So there's some that are just, they're global services, and they don't need to be in every single region. There are other services that when Microsoft start to roll them out, they don't wait until it's in all the regions across the world before they switch it on. So they might take some key regions and deploy it there. And then once that deployment's complete, they'll move on to the other regions and work their way across the list. But you'll find that we'll actually, North Europe and West Europe are very high on that list. East US and West US are another two that are very high on the list. So we're lucky in that respect. Azure Germany isn't actually operated by Microsoft. It's independent. This is the sovereign region. So the Azure Germany is actually independently operated by T-Systems International. And the China region is operated independently by 21 Vianet. So this is some of the platform level redundancy that we talked about. So when the region, I just chose North Europe and West Europe because they're the region pair that I would work with most. So whenever we deploy into Azure, we have the option to enable geo replication. When we enable geo replication, it replicates what's in that storage across to the other region pair. I think there's an SLA of around 5 seconds on that, but it's really impressive for what you get. You end up paying approximately double the price, so you're paying for the storage, and then there's a cost aspect as well to the network replication. So we're going to go through a pricing element later on, so I'll bring you through that, just because one of the questions we'll have is how do we price this up. But I guess what this is just saying is there's options for geo redundancy. So this is geo-redundant, so it goes from one region to another region. But there's also, if you couldn't have your data leave Ireland, for example, and you still needed resilience, then there's a thing called zone redundant storage, and that'll replicate within the data centers of the region. And that's why it's important to understand that regions aren't data centers. So when you go to the North Europe region, that there's about 5 or 6 data centers within there, and you can do replication across those, and those are they're completely separate in terms of all the core functions going on. So with the availability zones, these are these physically separate locations within a region. And each availability zone is made up of more than one data center. It has independent power, cooling, and networking, and it allows high availability and low latency replication. So one of the common misconceptions that we normally come across is that, oh, it's in the cloud. It's in the cloud, so and the ones that we get is it's in the cloud, so it's automatically resilient. So there are some services that when they're in the cloud, they're automatically resilient, but not all services, and that'll become apparent in a little while. But also, it's in Azure, so it's automatically backed up. So I get that quite a lot actually. And it's not completely true. So whenever you're coming in to do a design or an architecture, or you're thinking of starting to make use of the cloud in your enterprise, then it's just don't assume these things. It might be the case, but just don't assume it. And it's automatically secure. So yeah, it probably is more secure in Azure than it could be in a typical on-premise data center. And that's because of the measures that Microsoft take, but we can also do things to undo that security. And we can talk about that as we go along. And it's in the cloud, so it's automatically globally replicated. So not the case. And it's not even the case that it'll automatically be replicated to the region pair. That's something that we actually have to enable. So actually the default is that when we deploy something into Azure, that it's there in that one place. So when we look at each one of the different types that we can roll out, then there's a thing called infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service is your most basic. It's the most basic form of going into a cloud, and all you're doing is you're taking your VMs, your physical servers, and your virtual servers that are in your on-premise data center. And you're just creating a network and you're creating your infrastructure as you would on premise, but up in the cloud. So that can be really useful. So you have applications that just are not cloud native, and they still need to be accommodated. And that's typically what infrastructure as a service is. So the next is platform as a service. So with the platform as a service, a little more of that responsibility will fall onto the shoulders of Microsoft. So not all of it, but more. And what we're saying is now you're going away from you don't care about the virtual machine that underpins it. You don't want to update that operating system anymore. So you just consume a service. So that could be like a database or a website, and you're not worrying about the actual software underneath. That's all taken care of. And that's platform as a service. And then finally, you've got software as a service. So software as a service would be like your Dynamics 365 or Office 365 or Salesforce or one of those applications. So it's something that you purchase it and you consume it. You don't worry about scaling it, about monitoring it. It's just taken care of. And this gives you a look at all the models from a single pane. So you can see over here on the very left, you've got the traditional on-premise. So from applications right down to networking. So what we're seeing there is that the entire management of that stack is under your control. So you have full control over it, full responsibility for it. So as we start to move across to the infrastructure as a service, we're starting to let Microsoft take the responsibility for a little more of that. So if a disk was to fail, for example, then there's no model in Microsoft where that's something that you worry about. That's taken care of. But when you move across to infrastructure as a service, then patching of those VMs is actually something that's still your responsibility for. And I've had some customers think that the fact that the VM's running up in Azure, that the patching is taken care of. So just there are options to take care of that, but it's not taken care of out of the box. So know that from the operating system up, that's your responsibility. And that includes the making sure that they have connectivity to each other, things like that. And this won't be slides the whole way through. I'm actually going to bring into the portal and let you see what it looks like, because I think that can be really useful to help you sort of understand how it fits together. So then the next is the platform as a service, as we spoke about before. So even more of that is taken away, and we just get to concentrate on what it is we do. So if you have developers and they need access to a SQL database, for example, then they're not worrying about spinning up servers and setting the disks and getting the software installed, the SQL software. They just want a database. They spin up a database. They have a few options like, should we geo-replicate it? Should we back it up? They can just get going. They can get going quite quickly. It's a great service. Down to the very last one, which is software as a service. So that's the Office 365, Dynamics 365 that we spoke about. So what we're going to cover off here today is this area highlighted in green. So the infrastructure as a service and the platform as a service is really where Azure sits. And this is what we spoke about before, is just because this is a Microsoft cloud doesn't mean you can only use the Microsoft tools. You bring your own tools. That's the whole point of this. So you can bring your own tools and work as you've worked before, and then you can start to take on the benefits of the cloud. But one of the key things that we need to think about when we're doing deployments into the cloud is security. And knowing that it's a partnership, it's something that we're doing with Microsoft. So we're not just putting it in the cloud and now it's Microsoft's problem. Microsoft are taking care of quite a bit of it. But it's important that we know that where the boundaries are, what's important for us to do to make sure that we're secure, and what's Microsoft taking care of in the background. And Microsoft's doing some fantastic work in securing down the cloud, but we have to work with them. So, and it's getting that that balance correct. Do you know what I mean? So we need to make sure that if we deploy a server, that we don't leave it just open publicly on the internet. So for some applications, it makes complete sense to do that. So if you have a web server that's in an isolated part of your network, then you might say, well, I need to make that available to the whole world. So you open up the ports and say everyone can access this server. But if you had a SQL database server or an Active Directory server, that's not the type of server you want to open up to everyone. So the possibility is there to do it. So you just need to make sure that there's things put in place to make sure that doesn't happen. And this is where Microsoft go to these independent companies and bodies, and they make sure that the cloud environment is as secure as it can be. So they go through the ISO. So we have a few ISO certifications ourselves, but they go through this whole process to show that what they're using is compliant with that standard. And just to take that first one there, the ISO 27001, that doesn't mean that if you use Azure that your thing that you put inside Azure is ISO 27001 certified. It just means that the items that Microsoft are responsible for within there will be signed off for an audit. So that can take a lot of work away. So whenever you're going through your audit, especially when it comes to the physical elements, it's very easy to point them towards the Microsoft Trust Center, and it explains how this is all certified, and it brings down the part that you have to take care of down just to your application and your resources. Which brings us to the how do we start to put some control around what we deploy in Azure. So one of the first things is your identity is really important when you're deploying into the cloud, and we use that to control our access. So if I'm going to show you the Azure portal now shortly, but we can grant permissions at a multiple different layers. So one is at the subscription, which is the very top level component. Underneath the subscription is this entity known as a resource group. You can think of it as a folder. It's a group that holds resources, and it's only one deep. So you've got a subscription, and under the subscription you can either have so under subscription you have a resource group, and then inside the resource group is resources, and that's it. So you don't get resource groups inside resource groups, anything like that. It's just a subscription, resource groups, resources. So it keeps it nice and simple. So the access control that we can apply is there's a lot of them, and I'm going to show it to you now. But the sort of four main ones is owner. Now owner's everything. So if you have owner permission to a subscription, that's the top level that you can get on an Azure subscription. So we need to be very careful with owner. It's not something you want, a lot of people, if any people, to have. So the next step down from that is a contributor. A contributor can do most things that an owner can do, but not all things. So if you have like an external third party like myself, that you might say, I'm going to give Brian contributor access to your subscription, so I can see everything. I can make a lot of changes, but there's a few things that I can't do. So I can't give more permissions. So by letting me in, I can't let other people in. I would have to be an owner for that. Or user access administrator, but I can't just let other people in. So it gives you a bit of control that even though you've given me a lot of access, that I can't sort of add more access in the background that you're not aware of. But there's also things that we're going to cover later called locks that are really, really important. I can't modify locks is another thing I can't do as a contributor. So really important. There'll be people you want to see the environment. So sometimes like I would be added to an environment as a reader. So if I'm supporting something, it's just a lot easier to support something if you can visualize it. So if we can log in, see it, and access the resources, I can't make any changes, but at least I can sort of find the problem and say to them, problem is that needs to be restarted, or this is the wrong size or something. And sometimes that's enough. The user access administrator is the permissions it has is the permissions that the contributor doesn't have. So the user access administrator, can't make any changes, but it can modify locks. It can add other people in. So if you make me a user access administrator, well, I can't really do anything, but I can give other people permissions. Well, I could also give myself permissions as well. So again, another one you just want to be careful of. But what that gives us is the ability at a very basic level to do some separation of responsibilities. So if we wanted to say, if we had two sets of, if we had an application and it was in test and production, and you might say, okay, well, Brian, you can be a contributor. So we'll make you a contributor, and we're going to put a lock. So a lock is something we're going to cover in a little while. We're going to put a lock over the production resource group. What's good about that is I have everything I need to do my work. But if I went in and said, right, I'm going to blow away this test environment now and rebuild it because I've got this new thing that I want to try. And if I accidentally sort of click on the production resource group and try to delete it, locks are the things that save me there. So that makes sure that I can't do something that you don't want me to do. So in order for me to do something like delete production, then I would have to contact someone and say, someone who has that user access administrator or owner role, and say, I need to delete production. Can you take away that lock? And at that point, they'll say, if it's something they expect, they'll say absolutely and take the lock away. But if it's not, then they'll put a break on and say, hold on a minute, delete production, and then the conversation will go from there. So it can be really useful, and there's no cost to those things. Those are just things that we should use. So we use them to manage access to the resources, and it uses Azure AD identities. So that's users, guests, and groups. So I suppose the difference between a user and a guest is a user is in your Azure Active Directory, and a guest is in another. So your Azure subscription is under your Azure Active Directory. So if you add those users, then they're considered users. If you add it from a different Azure Active Directory than the one associated with the subscription, then they're considered guests. So it's just to know that there's a difference there. So you don't need to create, if I was doing work in your environment, you don't need to create a briansmith@yourcompany.com username for me to access it. You can actually add in my bsmith@codec.ie and then give me access through that. So again, we apply that to the subscription, the resource groups, or the resources. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so there's a little hands up button down there beside where you could type messages. So if anybody would like to see that security in the actual portal, it'll only take a few minutes, but if you'd like to see it, just if you could raise your hands and I'll bring you through that. Otherwise, I'll keep going. Okay. So, and if there's anything, we're going to have Q&A. So I've left Q&A for like 30 minutes at the end. Now, I'm a bit of a talker, so if we need to go back and go through anything, if you'd like to ask questions, show me how you create a database in Azure, or show me this, then I'll bring you through that. But this security stuff here is the stuff that I see that's not correct in a lot of places. So I like to just concentrate on it because this is really, really important, because in a lot of cases, your identity is what stops people that you don't expect to be in your environment from being in your environment. So there's measures we can put in place to put control around that. But what we have is who needs access. So you've got users, guests, and groups. So those are the ones we've covered off already. But then you've got these service principals and managed identities. So you could consider those service principals are like applications, and managed identities are when we give a resource within Azure access to another resource within Azure, so they can have their own identity. The actual resource within Azure itself has its own identity. So if I had a virtual machine and I wanted to give it access to some secrets in a key vault, then I can just give the virtual machine access rather than a person, which can be really, really useful. So we need to find out what permissions do we need. The permissions, they're grouped under these things called roles. So the owner, the reader, the contributor, those things that we talked, those are the default roles. They're the built ones, but we can also create custom roles. So the built-in roles, they're quite good, but they're very generic. So I've had customers that, well, one of the common cases that I would have for pulling, using a custom role was people, I would go in and everyone's an owner. So everyone can do everything, and it can become a bit of a mess. So then we have two ways to approach something like that. So we can go in and say, right, that's it. Everybody's a reader, which will break everything. Break everything. It'll bring productivity to a grind and halt. But what we can do is we can create a custom role based on that top level role and start to pull permissions away, so we can bring it back and get a bit of control on it that way. So it's much easier to do this from blank. But if you need to bring it back, then a custom role can be really useful for that. So of the people here today, who here has actually got an Azure subscription with resources deployed on it? If you could put up your hands. Okay, perfect. One, excellent. Okay, and then so I'm assuming then the rest don't have you don't actually have a cloud environment. So for the people that do, then I suppose it's taking a look at what that looks like. So what is the permissions at the moment? That's a really, really important step. And then how do we get it back to a place where it's not a problem? So for the people then that that don't have any Azure deployed yet, or they're just starting out, that's a good place to be. But know that this is something that you need to think about at the very beginning of the journey. So you need to make sure is how are we going to control access to this? Because not only from a security perspective, you don't want people creating things without any sort of governance around it. And we're going to come on to something called Azure policies quite soon. So we need to determine where do they need the access. So if you have a subscription, and you'll see what one of those looks like now shortly, but within that subscription, you're going to have a number of resource groups. So if I was in, and I often am for customers, and I'm only really responsible or involved with a particular application, so say it was some sort of a web application, then rather than giving me access to the entire subscription, then you can give me access just to the resource group. Then all the things around that, I don't even know they're there. I don't see them. So I only see what I have permissions to see. So you have to think about where do we give permissions to? And even inside that resource group, if I'm only responsible for that one SQL server, then you can just give me the access to that SQL server and I won't see anything else in there. I'll just see what I need to see. And it gives you, it's real powerful control over the environment. So the management groups are going to be really useful when you have more than one subscription. So there are reasons to have more than one subscription, and one of those would be if you have an enterprise agreement. Then whenever you purchase resources from within your Azure subscription, if it's say a Windows server, for example, then the Windows server will have potentially have a Microsoft Windows license attached to it. Now, if you're in production, that's perfect. So you can say, I'll spin up a Windows VM. I don't need to worry about the licensing. I'm renting the license for the Windows VM as I rent the compute that the VM sits on. And it brings a few advantages as well. So it does away with the dreaded Windows CALs. So if you're accessing servers up in Azure, in IaaS, you don't need Windows CALs to access those. And actually, just talking of the licensing, if anyone here has Windows 2008 or Windows 2008 R2, a real common use case in the last year that we've seen is when you move, that's out of support now. So Windows 2008 and Windows 2008 R2 are out of support. If you put those servers as they are up into Azure, then you get that extended. I think it's for 3 years. So that support, you go into extended support free of charge. It's just included as part of the rental. So it's probably a little incentive to migrate to Azure. Is that a good thing to do? Well, it depends. If you have no choice, it's good because now you went from unsupported to supported, but it's not a replacement for getting it onto like a properly supported operating system. I would do that first. So, but these management groups, what they do is they give you control over multiple subscriptions. So you might have 10 subscriptions, and rather than going across and saying, right, Brian has reader access to that one, Brian has reader access to that one, you can just say, right, Brian has reader access to the management group that's wrapped around those subscriptions. And then it inherits down and I have access to everything within each of those. So it provides a little bit of simplicity. So the subscriptions are in a tenant. Your tenant is just effectively your Azure Active Directory. So by default, it's something.onmicrosoft.com. And then you probably have a vanity domain, by your organization on that. But there's different types that you can get. So there's an enterprise agreement. So the EA. So depending on your organization. So there's that. If you've started off with a credit card, then you probably have a pay-as-you-go. There's also a cloud solution provider subscription, so CSP. Codec are a tier 1 CSP provider. So if you're on pay-as-you-go and you wanted to move to something like CSP, then that's something that we could help you with. If you're at a certain size, you might have an enterprise agreement already, and you can just make use of that. But those top 3 are all production type subscriptions, and this last one is a dev test subscription. So the dev test means that those licenses that we talked about before, you don't pay that. So where there's a Windows VM, it just removes the Windows operating system license cost. So similarly with SQL. So if you spin up something SQL, it'll just take away that license cost. But just be warned, that's very strictly for dev test, as you can imagine. So if you want to run dev test workloads up in the cloud, those dev test subscriptions are definitely something you should be looking at to bring down your cost. So then you've got resource groups. So they're used to control the management and the billing. And I'm just going to show you what those look like now. So give me 1 second. So James, can you see my browser window here?
Yeah, I can see that, Brian.
Perfect. Okay. So here we've got a subscription called Brian Smith MSDN. So this is my personal developer subscription. So this holds all the resource groups and the resources. So if I go in here to this, sorry, what I should have said was this is the actual Azure portal. So if you go to a web browser and go to portal.azure.com, this brings you into the general management of Azure. So there's subscriptions here. So that's where I've seen that. If I choose resource groups, so here's all the resource groups that I have. So I just have some little test items. There's a Minecraft container that I spun up for my daughters. But inside each one of these resource groups is your resources. So depending on where you are. So essentially there's subscriptions, resource groups, and then everything else is resources that are within it. So you can see here I've got various things. And I can set under this access control, I can actually set here who could see this. So you can go down through and I can see right, who has permissions to this. So you can see that I'm owner and these various other people are contributors and I've got a reader. So it's quite useful. So I can set permissions right up at the top layer. And you can see here that these are on the subscription. So the scope of this Aidan Smith permission is on the subscription and it's inherited down to the resource group. So then if I go inside to one of the actual resources, then I can take a look at, say, a key vault, for example. If I look at access control, and then here, you can see that these are all inherited, but I can give someone permission here, and then they'll only see that key vault that I've given them access to, nothing else. And just to show you these roles, so you have the top level ones, so there's owner, contributor, reader, and there's a user access administrator, but there's a lot of these other ones as well. Now these are the ones that apply only to Key Vault because we've selected a Key Vault resource. If we were to go right up to the top level, we just select that. Then this will give you all the permissions that we can assign at this top layer. So that list will be much more extensive. So it allows you to be quite granular with who can do what. And what's useful here is you might say, well, I don't want to make everyone just a contributor, because if I do that, then everybody can do almost everything. So what I might say is, like, we have a networking team, so it makes sense that the networking team can do the networking tasks. So that's something that we can work through. So with the policies work very hand in hand with permissions, but they're different. So I can say as part of a permission that Brian Smith has permissions to create virtual machines. What I can't do with permissions is say Brian Smith can create virtual machines only in North Europe. So I don't want things being spun up all around the world, because you have that capability out of the box. So you can say, I don't want anything outside of Ireland. So then I can use a policy to actually say, right, keep the only allowed region as part of this policy is North Europe. And that just makes sure that everything gets put into the correct region. So you can either put that into like a block mode or an audit mode. So you can say, if somebody tries to put something in the UK or the US, then stop them. So they just can't do it. Or just flag it on the security center, which I'll show you later. And that'll let you see. So it just gives you a bit of control. Another one is you could say, if we take a look at some costs, let me just show you something here. So Azure VM pricing. So the cost can start out quite low. And so say you got machines here. So they start at like €6 a month. And they go all the way up to 600. Now, if I was to go for something with GPUs, Oh, let me just take that away. So something with like a big heavy GPU. So this one costs €3,000 a month. So you might say, do you know what? I let my developers spin up those small machines, but not the big GPU intensive ones. Do you know what I mean? So if they want one of them, they have to come to me and I'll enable it for them. So there's options there that are available. And it's just to know that if you want, if trying to bring it in after you've already done a deployment is quite difficult. So know that there's policies that you can put in place that sort of say we can enforce naming standards. So we can say things have to be named a certain way through these policies. We can say only certain types of resources can be deployed, and you can change the policies that are applied based on the person logging in. So I might be allowed to do any VM, and someone else might only be allowed to do the small VMs. So we get granular access permissions to the subscription, the groups, and the resources. I think that's a duplicate actually. So then the next one that I want to cover off, I'll try and do this as quickly as possible because I'm conscious of the time, is the virtual networking. So with the virtual networks, now if anybody has questions, just put it into the chat window, and then I'll come back at the end and try and address those. So whenever you're using a virtual network, this is for the IaaS that we talked about at the beginning. So whenever we say we want to just make Azure an extension of our existing data center or data centers, then we can go through and say, right, let's create a virtual network. So when you're creating a virtual network, you have a thing called an address space. So I'm not going into too much detail, but if you're networking, if you're familiar with networking, it's a thing called like a subnet. So you just create a big subnet address range up in Azure, and it has to not collide with anything you have either on premise or that you might VPN connect to. And once you've done that, then that's the most basic building block for getting yourself onto Azure IaaS. So you create this virtual network, assuming that you need on-premise connectivity. You connect that then back to your office, and then it's just another extension. So if you have an office that has a data center that you attach to, this will be the exact same way. Only it's just all managed as code. So there's multiple options. So whenever you're thinking, you can add to the address space. So you create an address space, and within that you create subnets. Just be careful with the locking down the subnet. So by default, all the subnets within a virtual network can all talk to each other. They're fully open. So if you're creating subnets, which is quite typical, maybe you've heard the term LAN or DMZ, then typically those are blocked from each other. But in Azure, they're open. So we have to put in rules to lock it down. And again, this is something we can go through on a one-to-one because it can be quite involved. It's something that has to be thought of. So it gives us control. We can use these things called network security groups. So this thing where it's open by default. So we can use these things called network security groups to put some control around that. So it's like a firewall that you can wrap around a subnet. And you can say, well, then only web traffic is allowed in to this subnet, and there should be nothing else. Or only, so you could say none of these machines should be allowed to talk out to the internet. So even this thing, excuse me, even though this thing is sitting in the cloud, we might say we don't want any connectivity to or from the internet. This is literally only allowed to talk back to our on-premise over a VPN or a thing called ExpressRoute. So we can use network security groups to do that. You can reserve public IP addresses. So you can say, right, I've got a reserved list of public IP addresses. So this is useful for if you're creating DNS records that go to, they're called A records that point to an IP address. You don't want that IP address constantly changing. So you can actually reserve public IP addresses up in Azure. And that can be really, really useful. It does support IP4 or IP6, so you've got the choice. But then there's other things that we can sort of start to make use of when we're deploying into Azure. So if you're familiar with load balancers, those are available for free. So the basic load balancers are free of charge. There's a thing called a standard load balancer, which is a small charge associated with it. But when you try to do that, on premise, there's typically a device that you have to purchase to do that. So the fact that you get these things starting from free, and most people use the free tier. It's not that they try and get you on the hook. There's certain scenarios where you need the paid version. And that's when you start getting into these zone redundancy and things like that. There's application gateways, which gives you control over traffic. So you can say anything coming on this web URL that has this, put it over to that web server, and anything else, put it over to this other web server. So you can control the traffic based on the URL coming in. This is an application gateway. And then there's a web application firewall that you can add on to that so that it checks for any common attacks. So if you create a web server and you don't want to just put it on the internet, just like you wouldn't if you had it in your own data center, then you can just spin up the service which sits in front of your web server and gives you layer 7 protection. Now, when you're connecting back, there's two options. There's VPNs and ExpressRoute. With VPNs, it doesn't really require a special link. All you need is an internet, and we need somewhere for Azure to talk to. So usually it's your firewall, or if you have a dedicated VPN concentrator. So that just connects the two networks together. So now that's where you don't need public IP addressing anymore. So once they're connected, say you had a file server and you wanted to put it up on Azure, excuse me, so you wouldn't want to have a public IP address on your file server. So you give it a private address and you just have to be able to access it. So a VPN is what you use for that. And ExpressRoute is more like a dedicated connection. They don't use the public internet, so it keeps it on your ISP's equipment right on the Azure. So only certain ISPs support that. I think all the ones in Ireland do already. Again, I'm trying to move quite quickly, just given the time constraints. But this with the three basic components of IaaS, you've got compute, networking, and storage. So the networking we've just briefly touched on there. So we can create networks. We can create as many of them as we want. We can create a test network that has the exact same range as production, which can be quite useful if you want to replicate an issue. So I've had customers where they had problems, and with a few clicks, we can actually completely replicate their entire environment. And that's something we can show you in a different session if you were interested in. And we can automate that whole process. So we have some places where there's development, and there's a script that we run. It just copies the VNet, copies all the disks from snapshots, spins it all up, and then they can do any testing that they want without worrying about unpacking production. But with the compute, so there's various sizes. So that's like what we spoke about before. Some of them are inexpensive and some can be quite expensive. So depending on what your purpose is. So if you have, there's general purpose, compute optimized, memory optimized, storage optimized, GPU. So there's a lot of options depending on what you're trying to do. Now, if I spin back to the pricing page, and we could show you something here. So pricing. So say you had a task and it was really compute heavy. I'm trying to find a really, really expensive one. Okay, so like $3,000. So if you needed this, it has 24 processors, 224 gigs of memory, a beast of a GPU. So this thing is really high spec. If you wanted to run that for a month, it'll cost you 3,000. So, and you might say, that's a lot. Now, the good thing about running these things within the cloud is whenever you choose a size, you don't have to stick to that size. So one thing that you could do is you could actually say, well, I only use it during the day. So if you need to be that size all the time, but it's not a 24/7 box, then you say, right, well then I'm going to turn it off on Saturdays and Sundays. We don't use this thing at the weekend, so there's no point in paying for it at the weekend. And by just turning it off on Saturdays and Sundays, you're reducing your cost by 2/7. So that can have a huge impact. So where on premise it doesn't make sense to turn things on and off, or it's just not worth the bother. But up here it's really, really important that we have that control. Then you could take that a step further. Then you could say, right, so we've removed 2/7 of the cost. So now we don't actually use this thing outside of 8 to 6. So let's turn it all off at 6 o'clock in the evening and turn it back on at 8 o'clock in the morning. So now it's available for the users as it was before, but now we're not paying for that whole 6 p.m. through to 8 a.m. cycle either, and that brings your cost down further. Now you might say this has a big job to do at the end of the month. So at the end of the month, this thing has to do a lot of crunching. So we just want it up and running, even just for patching and things like that, or for light use. But at the end of the month, that's when it needs the grunt. So you could actually say, I need it for like on the last day or on a particular day, I need it for 8 hours. So when you look at this one that was ridiculously expensive before, like, well, depends on what you determine as ridiculously expensive. But if that was out of your range, well, you might say, well, do you know what? For most of the month, that could just sit on an expensive tier. But at the end of the month, I do need all the, I do need 224 gigs of RAM. And that'll only cost you $4.20 an hour. So if you just multiply that by like 10 hours, so there's €42, and you've got all that power. Now to buy that on premise would be a real challenge. Now, let me just switch back here. So, and I suppose the point I'm trying to get there is when you choose a size, when you choose a SKU that you're going to go for, you're not locked to it. The only thing they remember is to change size, it's a reboot. So it's just, so how long does it take? Like, it takes only a few seconds to change the size, but it does take the time for the machine to shut down gracefully. Then we just change the size, and then for the machine to start up gracefully. So for most people, that's within 5 minutes. So if you can tolerate a 5-minute outage, then this is a really, really powerful way of saving a lot of money, but still getting the the real benefit of the cloud is you get that grunt when you need it, and when you don't, you give it back. So there's various generations. So there's a thing called a D series machine. Let me just see if I can show you that over here. So I have this set to then go to general purpose. So you can see here, like there's so there was an A1, and then there was an A1 version 2, and then like here's the version 4 of the D series, and each of the different types, they have different properties. So if you look here, you've got the DA series, and this tells you what it is. So here's the processors. It's a 3.35 gigahertz processor. So you can know what's actually underneath this whole thing. It's actual infrastructure. It's and it's like it is in the data center, but it's just much more flexible. So you have that choice. You have the scalability. So you can use a thing called a scale set. So if you have a virtual, say you have a web application and it's in an actual server, so you can spin that up. You could put 2 VMs and put them in front of a load balancer. Like another thing you can do is use a thing called a scale set. And what that scale set will do is automatically allow that to grow. So as you need more, it'll spin up new VMs for you and just automatically put them behind the load balancer. So it just makes it easier to scale up, actually to scale out more accurately. And then as you don't need it anymore, you can start to bring that back in again. Different applications, will support it depending on a thing called state. Now, when you're looking to do a VM, so there's a number of different options that are available. So you can select an image from the VM gallery. You can upload your own custom prepped image, or you can use an ARM template. So if I just let you see what it looks like, you'll understand what this gallery is. So if I go over here and I choose virtual machines, and I say I want to create a virtual machine, then this, if you look here, so this is some of the default options. So we can make this an Ubuntu server, we can make it an Oracle Linux server, or we can make it 2019, 2016, or 2012 R2. So I'm not sure who here's Windows and who here's Linux, or a mixture of both. But that's, so you've got this. You could also, oops, sorry, wrong one. You can also browse the wider options. So it's not just base OSs. So you can have things with software built into them. Like if you want a firewall, like a proper, let's say you have a checkpoint firewall on premise, and you'd like to extend that up into the cloud, then you can go through here and see if there's a checkpoint option available. Checkpoint. If I could spell checkpoint. And then you select whichever one you want, and then it'll deploy a virtual machine with that image in there. So there's lots of different options. You can have a rundown through it and see what makes sense for you. So with the scale, like we talked about before, we have different options for the scale. So some have more processor, some have more memory, some have GPU, some don't. Some have SSDs, the solid state disks. Some have regular hard drives, and it's all what are you trying to achieve? and picking the best, most cost-effective option for that. So this is just bringing through what I was showing you in that article. So there's the base OSs, and then there's these applications as well. So you can choose from pre-built images. And just to call out, like this people used to laugh at this one, but it's true. And I believe that at the moment there's more Linux deployed into Azure than Windows VMs. So there's lots of Linux, and we do a lot of deployments for customers. And ours is about 2/3 Windows, 1/3 Linux when we're doing deployments. Particularly when we get into containers and things, we would lean more toward the Linux. But if you want to create your own VM, your own custom build, what you can do is you can create an image. So it's just if you have Hyper-V, you just create a VM, do what you need to do to it, create a VHD. Just important that it's a VHD, not a VHDX. And then we just upload that into Azure and we can create a VM from it. So it gives us a lot of options. And that's essentially how we can use that to migrate up to the cloud. There's a solution called Site Recovery Manager. And with Site Recovery Manager, we can actually replicate an on-premise server. It doesn't have to be a virtual server. It could be a physical server. It could be Linux. It could be Windows. And we just replicate that. And what it does is it just copies the machine up as a VHD file and then creates a VM from it. So it's quite good to see. And then these are what are called ARM templates. So when you begin your Azure journey, you're going to start doing a lot of your work in the Azure portal, this portal that we're working through. But as you start to get further into it, you'll start to deploy as code, it's called. So this is infrastructure as code. And you don't have to really, this will be too much for now, but just know that this is a thing. So when we do our deployments, we always do them as code where possible. And what it means is it's nice and repeatable. So this piece of code that you're looking at here, essentially all it's doing is it's quite readable. So if you look here, this one's creating a Microsoft. Actually, James, can you see my cursor when I'm moving the cursor?
Yeah, I can, Brian. Yep.
Perfect. So this is just creating a network interface which attaches to a VM. So it's just saying the location this is deployed to, it's the same location as a resource group. This is for saying how many of them. So we can feed in, we need 10 of them, and that'll just loop through and create 10. It sets what it should be. Don't create this until these other things are already there. So as you start to get into this code, this is what's really important. But what's useful about it is a few things. One is if anybody here has documentation that accurately reflects what's actually deployed in your on-premise or your cloud, then you're better than most. So usually it's about out of date. So we have some customers and they actually enforce all deployments through code. One, it means that everything's documented so we can see what's there. And when people make changes, they're making them as code. They're checked on a source repository, and we can see what's different. So we can say, oh, hold on a minute. Somebody actually added a new dependency in this line here that wasn't. And if you've never seen source control, it'll highlight it. So it'll say like this line's bright green because it's a new line, and this line's red because somebody's taken that line away. So it gives you full visibility of what's going on. So it's not something you jump maybe straight away into doing, but know that that's a thing that you can work toward, especially for production applications. And then when you need to spin things up, then that's a really useful tool. Okay. So this one goes through. I'm going to sort of skip this quite fast because I know we're starting to run out of time. But there's two principles, which is fault domains and update domains. So within Azure, when you do a deployment of a resource, you can have up to 3 fault domains, and you can have up to 20 update domains. So fault domains are for unplanned outages within Azure. So Azure is just a data center like any other, so it can have outages. So like a power could go on a rack, or a switch might fail in a rack, and it'll impact all the resources within that rack. But you've got 3 fault domains, and what that essentially means is if a rack was to go down, then it won't affect anything in a separate update domain. You know what I mean? So it allows you to plan for resilience. Now, if you had 30 web servers, if you needed, say you needed 20 web servers to serve your traffic and you wanted to make sure you were covered, then you have to allow for the loss of a third of your resources. If you need to make sure it's kept at a certain level. Now, what you could do is have it scale up. So if you drop by 10, that you could have it scale up and another new 10 for you. The update domains, what they're saying is it's not really tied to any particular rack. They're just saying that if virtual resources are in separate update domains, Microsoft won't do anything that'll impact more than one update domain at a time. So if you've got 20 VMs across 20 update domains, then never should more than one be impacted at a time. They'll go through the 20 update domains and do their maintenance. So this is another thing just to know, that there are certain SLAs provided depending on the service. And this is just a wee table. It's a useful table to know. And I believe we'll be sharing this presentation after, so you can come back to this. But what do the nines mean? So if you use something that's 99.9 availability, that means in any particular month, it can be down for 43 minutes. So just know what your acceptable downtimes are, and that'll help you determine what these are. And then when you start to put various resources on top of each other, how do you bring all those SLAs together to give you a single SLA? Now, what I might just do is pause here for a second and just see if we got any more. Is there any questions at this point that I haven't covered off? Or was anybody hoping to see something and they weren't sure? Okay, so I'll keep going. So one of the things we want to say is we need to take simple steps to secure and manage your Azure VM. So one is secure your resources. So we've got this thing called the Security Center. So if you look here, this is what it looks like. So it takes a look at what you've deployed within Azure, and it'll say, here's some recommendations. They're not always exactly accurate. Like if you have something opened up to all traffic on the internet, then that may be something you've done on purpose because it's web server. Otherwise, it'd be a denial of service on your own resource. But if it's something like a domain controller, then that could be a problem. So it'll take a look for common issues, without too much knowledge. It'll just say, listen, here's things that you need to look at, and you can go in and say, right, that's something I care about, that's something I don't care about, I expect that, I don't expect that. And it's really useful. So when you start doing your deployments, or for those people that have said that they're already in Azure, have a look at your security center. So it's down, it's actually quite accessible. So if you go click here and we go to the security center, this one won't have much in it because it's just a wee dumping ground I have for pet projects. But when you go in here, it takes a look at what you've deployed, and it gives you a thing like this. So you can drill into it and say, and like this is saying enable MFA, managed access and permissions. So I just sort of give out permissions to this. It's fine. There's nothing in there. There's some elements where it's saying it's HTTPS isn't enforced. So that's something you might not have known. Only you can go in here, and there's certain options. So we can go in here and say, okay, no, that definitely should be enabled. So click quick fix. You say which ones you want to enable it on, remediate, and it'll just take care of that. So now that will enforce HTTPS. So this is a really powerful tool. So make use of it. So take a look down through what's here, and see, is there anything that you need to take a look at. It's really useful at finding issues. Sorry, where am I here? Oh yeah, here. Okay, so protect your data. So there's a service called Azure Backup. So this isn't just for backing up your cloud resources. So you can use this to back up all your resources. So anything sort of Microsoft workloads, it's good at backing up, and Linux. So what we can do here is you create a thing called a recovery vault up in Azure, and then you have two choices. If you're on premise, you can either put an agent onto a server. So say you had some server and there was a folder in it that did FTP, people FTP stuff into this folder, and you wanted to back that up, say once a day. then you could just put the agent inside that machine, and it'll look at that folder, and once a day it'll just back it all up to cloud. You don't need to open up firewall ports back to backup infrastructure. Put it in, it'll just put it straight up over a HTTPS connection. Something just to be aware of. What Microsoft do is whenever they're backing things up, they encrypt it on your machine. So whenever you back up a folder with some files in it, they'll encrypt that as a blob, and then they'll send it up to Azure. Microsoft have no knowledge of what's in there. They have no access to it. It's completely blocked. Only yourself has access, and that's all handled with a key. So just be careful with the key, because if you lose access to it, Microsoft can't help you because they don't have access to any of your data. And then monitor the health of the application. So if you have software that you develop or software that you don't, then you can deploy log analytics and a thing called application insights that'll give you visibility right into the application and the infrastructure and how it's working. So this can be really useful. So we use this to provide a managed service to our customers. So there's some customers where we look after certain applications for them based on infrastructure, and if there's any thresholds that are breached, the standard ones are there for, like, if processor is pinned beyond 90% for more than 5 minutes, we just get a little message. We take a look and make sure it's okay. Do services being down, and you can get right into the application, and you can see if there's IAS logs. That we're getting a lot of 404s, or a lot of 401s, something like that. And we can sort of feed that back into the system and let people know, so we can get it remediated. And then finally, we're going to look at Azure Storage. So again, back to the three sort of underpinnings of the Azure IaaS. So there's compute and network, which we've talked about briefly. Now, I know I'm talking really fast because we're trying to fit it all into the hour and a half. But the last one is storage, and storage is really important. So what we need to do is, there's different types. So there's standard storage and there's premium storage. So standard storage is like regular spinning hard drives. So you probably heard of 10K or 15K RPM disks. So that's standard. And then there's SSDs. So they're premium. So what we can do then is we create disks from that storage. So you can create an OS disk or a data disk. And again, you could say, well, I want my OS disk to be premium, but I've got this big 4 terabyte disk that has a lot of data on it, not used that much. So I'm not going to use a 4 terabyte premium disk. So you can mix and match. So you can say, let's put a standard disk on for the data, and go from there. So the speed, the performance. So you might bring a disk up in size, not for capacity, but for performance reasons. So the bigger the disk, the more performance it has. So I've seen disks that have less than 100 gigs, but they've got terabytes in size, just to get lots and lots of throughput. They're really write intensive. And something else to make you aware of, there's a thing called a temporary disk, which confuses everybody. So if I go over here and you look at this temporary storage, so if I say, right, this A8 VM has 80 gigs of what used to be called storage, it's now more accurately called it as temporary storage. What's good about these is it's local to the hypervisor, so it's local to the machine up in Azure, so it's quite fast. But when you reboot that machine, that gets wiped, so it's very ephemeral. So don't put anything in there that you care about. But if you had something that had, let me try and find. So these, see the S in here, that means that it's premium. So I can take SSDs. So this is a half a terabyte of SSD, local SSD, which is blazingly fast. So you might say, well, do you know what? I need to crunch a lot of, it's very write intensive, read intensive on the disk. I don't need to keep it. So that would be the perfect use for something like this. Like if you have a SQL server, the tempdb, people put the tempdb onto this storage because it's really, really fast. So there's no point in paying for that performance. Wouldn't get it here. Just be aware that when you reboot the machine, it'll probably be gone. So if it moves from in the background, when you reboot a VM, if it goes to a different host, that'll be gone. And this is what it looks like inside the machine. So you got your operating system disk like you would expect. If you add a data disk, it's over here. So the D drive, this temporary drive, if you go into it, there's a little text file just saying, don't put anything you care about here, because when you reboot, it'll be gone. So that's what's important to call out there. So the other one is we could do replication. So there's two, we'll probably end it on this note. So there's two ways to protect a machine. So if you have, or there's two uses for a thing called Azure Site Recovery. If you have a virtual server that's on premise, and you say, right, I'd like to put that up in the cloud, either as a test or as part of a migration or a DR protection, then you use a thing called Azure Site Recovery. Now there are third-party tools, but the Azure Site Recovery is really powerful, and it's really well priced. So what you have is the first 30 days you don't pay for. So if they consider that if you're replicating a machine and you stop the replication within 30 days, then you're probably doing a migration more than a DR protection, so there's no cost. So they're going to let you move. They're going to take away any barriers to entry. So you can take that machine, replicate it up, and then if you stop it within 30 days, you don't pay for anything. After that, it's a small enough fee. I can't remember actually what it is. It's around €10 a month. And that'll replicate in real time this machine up to Azure. And then you can, when it's replicating, so that you might just leave it on, say, right, perfect. I get DR protection for the price of replication and a bit of storage up in Azure. So it'll replicate the machine up, and then when the machine's up, then we can you can spin it up as a test without impacting productions. You can say, right, did that work? And will this application work up in Azure? So you just spin it up, try it out, have someone log into it and say, oh, do you know what, that works or it doesn't, and you go from there. So it's a common use for it. And then you can also protect from region to region. So if you put something in the Azure North Europe, which is in Dublin, and you might say, I need, part of me business criteria says it needs to be DR protected, so you can replicate that across the Amsterdam and West Europe, and then that'll give it without having to pay for the compute. So you're just paying for that replication across. Okay, sorry, and I know I went really fast. I tried to cover a lot of stuff in like just over an hour. So was there any questions that anyone had? Okay. So again, just on the feedback form. So I know that if you could fill out that feedback form just to let you know what you thought of the session. If you want any follow-up, if there's something that you're looking to address and I haven't covered off as part of the session, just let me know and we can come back to you.
So Brian, thanks for that, Brian. Yeah, just to add to that, so within the feedback form, I think it's question 14. There's an option there for you to fill in any additional comments. So if anybody requires that workshop, we mentioned about the 2-hour free of charge appointment with Brian. Yeah, please fill in that question 14 and we'll get back to you once you view the feedback form. We can set it up for you.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, folks.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for your time. Thanks, everyone.